Domain-driven design.
Yeah.
Because,
Let's talk about that.
We only have 2 hours, right?
Just kidding, I think we can go until Layla gives us the hook.
Layla.
Yeah, I think it's at least 4.
I don't know. We're getting a dirty look from Layla in the back room here.
Oh,
yeah. Okay. All right. We'll keep it on schedule.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we got it. We're all under control.
So what we were going to talk about today, actually, it's kind of this meta thing. We're going to talk about a talk. We're going to talk about this conference session I've been doing, some at regular. I've even done it as keynotes, a keynote at domain-driven design conferences, about easier ways to learn that, as Cora said, it's a huge topic, right? And I've actually, even before I put this talk together, I had already been doing talks, even in the .NET space, about, the process of learning, right? And even it seemed that even in DDD, not even in DD, but DDD, there's really kind of this issue about, you really have to know all of DDD in order to do it right. And so that's why I took the same kind of learning ideas and then applied it to domain-driven design for the idea of not just learning DDD, but I also did it for the benefit of so many people who are already excited about DDD, maybe using DDD, and they want to bring their team on board, and trying to help those people also with that process. So that's what the talk is about. And we've already, you two and I have, or us three, we three have already had a conversation about that. And it was just interesting to talk about the talk and why it exists and some of the points in it and how it relates to other technologies, not just domain-driven design. So how do you want to go about this, right? I'm not giving the presentation. We're going to talk about the presentation. So based on the conversation we had already, do you have some questions or want to?
Well, I mean, I know one of the things that came up when we were chatting earlier this week was the fact that it's a journey when you're learning a topic, and something might click for you sooner than it clicks for me, and vice versa. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
And it might take hearing it a few different ways, seeing it a few different ways. And this is something conversation I had with my son a lot, that you might need to have this described to you in different ways. That's part of being a teacher, is figuring out for this student, what do I need to say? What metaphor do I need to use? What story do I need to tell so that it makes sense and resonates for them? And so I know that was something that really clicked for me when we were chatting earlier this week.
Yeah, about it's like reading the room in a way. So one of the one of the triggers for this talk, even though it had been in my head, was that I had written a tweet and used the word purists. I had talked about DDD design purists, right? Like, because I'd already been going about sharing domain-driven design differently. And I'd gotten some pushback from people, and I used that word and it kind of triggered it, understandably, a negative reaction, which is why I wanted to dig into it. And the way I approached it in that talk was, talking about pragmatic versus principled, right? I pulled back on the word purist and used the word principles, about, understanding all of the principles before you get there versus approaching it pragmatically.
So by purist, you meant understanding everything before even starting to using that, right? Is that correct? Can you elaborate a little bit more on what purist means?
I think, the definition of doing it properly.
All right.
And even just doing DDD, like, to me, doesn't even make sense as a phrase. For me, domain-driven design is this collection, and it's one that goes together, but a collection of wonderful ideas, wonderful guidance, right? And putting them together, you can achieve great things. But those ideas and guidance, even many of them on their own, are so valuable and beneficial. So, my big example that I shared in the talk. So, my learning path, right? I mean, there's the DDD Mind Map. Actually, I'll share screen. So I'm gonna pull up some various.
All right, go ahead.
I could click this one, that one, this one. You see the slide? I'll just gonna.
There it is.
Okay, but I'm gonna. Whoops. Well, here. If I play, will it play from there? Yeah. So, this is the domain-driven design mind map, right? And that's pretty overwhelming, right? If you're like, you have to understand not only all of these things, but how they relate to one another, right? So, even though I don't say, okay, we're going to learn all of this. I do when I'm working and sharing with teams, or I'm coaching or something, I do let them see this, right? This, just FYI, this is the big picture, just so you know what you're getting into. But then pulling back. So one of the most important pieces of domain-driven design, and even Eric Evans, who wrote the book, literally said if he was writing the book again, he would start with bounded context instead of later on in the book. But so this bounded context, there it is. The most important thing, and he also says, and the most misunderstood, which is very true. I didn't even understand it when I first started learning about domain-driven design ideas, but I understood one of the concepts of it, which was this idea of boundaries, right? And here we are at a .NET conference, right? So hopefully some people have heard of Entity Framework, or maybe even have some experience with it. I was doing Entity Framework, and just the idea of boundaries was so important, because when we first started learning Entity Framework, we were, pointing it to our huge legacy databases with 1,000 tables and 17 million relationships between them, right? And working with this, every time you were thinking about your data model, it was everything all at once. And so the lessons of boundaries from DDD bounded context actually were how I first was able to apply ideas and guidance from DDD to make my life better, right? It gave me the tools, mental tools, like the intelligence tools I needed to look at that huge data model and start understanding how to extract smaller things that I could work with more easily. I mean, I'm still kind of data focused at that point, right? I'm not even domain focused, but still the idea of the boundaries was like the first thing. And, from there, another idea, from there, another idea.
That brings me to a question, because I'm super curious. Currently, nowadays, how would you describe what a bounded context is to a beginner? Like, what's your current take on that with your current knowledge and experiences?
Well, I start small, right? Because it is so many things, right? I mean, so backing away from how would I, just kind of addressing what it really is, it's the expression of the ubiquitous language, right? It's most often an expression of a particular core or subdomain, right? But those things are important to understand when you have a better understanding of domain-driven design. But at first, none of that would really make any sense, right? Because you have to understand all those things. So the way I start with bounded context, actually, let me see if I can flip. Ah, yeah, this is not the right way. Oh, there, I was on it. Okay. This is how I like to start explaining bounded context. And this analogy actually comes from Eric's book, because Eric has a brilliant mind. So, why try to reinvent his great ideas? So his way of explaining it is, it's about you're taking a big complicated problem and breaking it down into smaller solvable problems, right? And those bounded contexts are those smaller, more easily solvable problems, with the knowledge that eventually we have patterns to do it. Eventually you can get those smaller solvable problems to interact with each other, have some kind of connection. So the analogy with the cells is, each of these cells has this boundary around it, which is the membrane. So each cell is protected from what's in the other cells, and it's the membranes that decide what information, not only what information, but how it gets passed from one cell to another, right? So so the idea of bounded context is, taking a unit, a small solvable part of that problem, and just focusing on that, not worrying about what's in the other cells, not worrying about what's going on in the other bounded contexts, right? Prior to that, being able to figure out how to identify them is an art, right? It comes from experience, and nothing's ever perfect, right? But just looking at a problem and turning it on its head, and what if we approached it this way? What if we approached it that way? So how does that compare to how you share that when you're talking to people who are curious about domain-driven design and bounded contexts?
I can totally agree, because what I think about bounded context is I like to try to talk about examples. Like, if we want to build a car, for instance, there will be probably a group of people who would like to talk about its aerodynamics and build a model that fits their needs, right? Because they would like to try it out in some sort of an environment that tests how it works with the air. Probably there will be a different group of people that will use more or less the same language. They will be talking about cars, but they will mean something different because they talk about graphics design and things like that. Probably, I'm super sure, I'm not building cars for a living, but I guess they would need a different model for that. Even though together they build a living thing like cells, they are building, for instance, a human being, right? All together. So I can relate that. It totally makes sense. That's a perfect metaphor. Thank you for that. I forgot that, even though it's in Eric's book, right?
Yeah, and I don't forget it because I'm always using it. So, going back to this idea of, as opposed to like, I want to learn DDD, now from the perspective of, I love DDD, I want my team to learn it. I had a really interesting experience, and I've seen this particular experience is like just like the perfect story about it, although I see it all the time. I had a friend who is an architect at a huge global company. And he's a brilliant guy, and really interested in DDD, and they were embarking on a new project, or a new version of their project. So not really evolving legacy, but just really rethinking it. And he wanted to use DDD, wanted to leverage DDD in doing so. So sat down and started teaching his teams. He was responsible for a number of teams, about domain-driven design. And there was one other person who was on one of those teams who was already had experience with it and also really loved it. And they started by with a list of terms, like terms from the tactical, like the kind of architect, the actual implementation of your software. So, terms out of that mind map, aggregates and aggregate roots and value objects and a ubiquitous language and, terms, and kind of freaked out the team. And they got to the point where they said, we don't want to hear anything about DDD anymore. Right. So he called me, Julie, help. And I was there for a week, kind of, doing a level set, right? Getting them started again, but finding a path that worked for them. So some of that was using my experience of helping people learn DDD, but some of it was also, again, what I said before, reading the room, right? And this is one of the things that's been, like for many people, so hard not doing in-person stuff anymore, because it's really hard to read the room, when you got 15 people on the screen and half of them don't have their cameras on and blah, blah, blah. You can't read the room.
You lose out on the body language.
Yeah. And be able to respond to that or people's interactions or whatever. Anyway, it was a great week. There was a lot of mic drops, but I would like to share like my, oh my God, so emotional thing. The last day I was there, one of the members of the team, smart guy. And he had been one of the, I don't want to hear about it anymore. He said to me, I never really thought about value objects before, but now that I understand them, so that was a big win. Like understanding value objects is not easy, but smart guys. They all guys on that team, or they were always looking to grow their team though. Anyway, he said, I never really thought about value objects before, and now that I understand them, I see how beautiful they are and how important they are. And because of that, I'm really excited about learning more about what DDD can do for me and do for our code and do for our team and our relationships with our all of that. And I was like, oh, like, right. Like it was just such a great win. It just made me so happy, right? Because I really got through to them and helped them. I feel the same way about DDD as my friend, the architect, did, right? But it just had a different way of approaching sharing that.
Yeah.
So
I think that, and I learned it from trying to teach people different stuff. If you throw definitions at people, just definitions, probably you will scare some people, right? Without showing them how can you benefit from thing A, thing B, thing C, and how does it relate to the actual experience, past experience, then probably you will need someone like you to fix after myself, right?
Yeah. First they were like, can you come write it? I'm like, no. I'm not going to do that. But, so a lot of that definitely happens with the tactical stuff, the implementation stuff. But then there's the whole strategic stuff, strategizing, thinking, planning, just figuring out what those bounded contexts might be. And the bigger thing is the collaboration with the domain experts. So another interesting thing, and I again see this all over, but with this particular gig that I did, there were 2 different Scrum teams involved, and they never really worked together. So we did some mob programming together. One of the sessions of mob programming I did with both teams together in the room had nothing to do with their project. It was just to, get an idea, just a different challenge, coding kind of a challenge to give them the idea of working together. And then we started working on pieces of, their different responsibility, and, watching them interact and realizing the value of different people bringing different ideas to the table and collaborating like that. You know, in this case, we were working with the Scrum teams. We didn't have like the domain experts there, right? But it's just giving them that experience. That, you know, so there's like I said, so many great ideas in there, but you can't learn them and be expert at them all at once. But there's no reason not to explore them and find something that resonates with you, right? So when I talk, so another slide I'll share, I'll just flip to it first, and then, oh, actually, like it's that series of slides, you know.
Well, and Julie, we have Silicon Orchid tells us that the room waves hello and nods approvingly. So I guess we have that going for us.
Yeah. Thank you. Since I can't read the room, I do appreciate that. Let me see if I can play this, because this is, you know, like you said earlier, everybody's learning path is going to be different. And I certainly never said, okay, today I'm going to learn about aggregate roots. Today, I'm going to learn about ubiquitous language. Like, it just, you know, it just didn't work that way. So this is just a quick look at, you know, in hindsight for me, of kind of my path. Like, it was a really big deal coming from a data-driven background. I mean, I started programming in the late 80s. I'm really old. Right? Data-driven, totally background. So that was huge, right? That was really, for me, kind of the first thing. But then the very next thing was this concept of boundaries, right? Not understanding. I really didn't understand bounded context. I thought that's what I was doing, but really all I was doing was taking advantage of this idea of the boundaries, right? And it took me a while. Actually, I was writing an article, and a friend of mine who's like does DDD training, and, you know, it was a really big deal. This was in my early days of domain-driven design. And he was very clear about making sure that I didn't use the word bounded context when I was referring to this, because I wasn't really doing it, right? So like that also was helpful, having people guide me. But, you know, then I got that idea. So yeah, I'm really just talking about boundaries, right? And then if you're doing microservices, maybe not DDD, but you might be familiar with this idea of having separate databases. And, you know, again, all these years of data-driven design and relational databases and normalizing databases and reusing code and blah, 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 blah. This was very challenging for my brain.
Right.
Very, very challenging. Aggregate root, you know, so now we're getting into the implementation, the tactical side of domain-driven design, right? And you know, this was a little hard, and I would love to just teach what every single one of these means. But my point here is, you know, if you're looking at the mind map, these are pieces of the mind map, right? And kind of how I got there, right? And then there was value objects, which, as I mentioned before, well, for some people, for me, oh my God, it was so hard to wrap my head around. Hopefully this isn't redundant for too many people. If you've heard me talk about this before, I heard, read, watched, I think 5 different descriptions and explanations of value objects until the 5th one. And it wasn't because the 5th one was correct. The 5th one, plus everything else I had taken in about value objects, like all of that information, the composition of all of those bits of all those ideas, finally gave me my aha moment. And that was over a very long course of time. I do not mean a day. I mean a half a year, when I finally went, you know, I was kind of going along with him a little, but it wasn't until that I finally went, oh, I really get it now. I really understood. And once, you know, and then more and more, right? Ubiquitous language, just it's something that gets a little difficult when people are first learning, because they think it applies to the whole project, and then that screws you up. And that was kind of my problem too. Like, it's actually ubiquitous per bounded context. And it wasn't until I got all of that stuff really sorted out in my head that I finally understood bounded context, right? So bounded context, the most important thing, probably the first thing you should learn in domain-driven design. And I didn't get it. I didn't get it until I'd gone through all this. But in the meantime, I'm still doing, taking advantage of these other ideas in my software, which is getting better and better along the way, right? And then, and then on and on and on, right?
Well, but I think that was one of the things we talked about earlier in the week, is that you don't have to understand the complete picture before you can start applying these things in an effective manner. And is it helpful to know the entire thing? Sure. But, that process takes months, years in some cases. And, I don't think any of us can afford to just sort of sit around and, well, I'm just going to study this topic for 18 months until I'm an expert, and then I'm going to apply it.
Right.
We all started writing code with,
Right.
let's just call it an incomplete understanding of the programming language we were using at the time. So you have to take those tools and start applying them. And I think that's, at least for a lot of us, that's how we learn. You've got to start using it. The theory is great, but until you start trying it for yourself, it's that, what's that adage from the medical community? You see one, do one, teach one, right? I mean, there's got to be a little bit of, all right, now get in there and see what happens.
Plus, I think
I want to respond to the last two comments I see here. One from Fuel Snubble. I've been in a number of DDD trainings. I still don't get it. First of all, sorry. So I would like to highly recommend, if you have access to Pluralsight, even if you can get one of those free 10-day trials, Steve Smith and I just redid our course, Domain-Driven Design Fundamentals. And that's why you are who we made the course for. We've had people say, I tried to read this book, that book, and I just couldn't get it. I watched the course, and the course gave me what I needed to go back and really learn, right? So the course gives, it's fundamentals, right? But it's not like be an expert in DDD, but it's just like understand these fundamental concepts. So I don't know if you have access to Pluralsight, but that's my best resource. There's wonderful books and tons of great content on YouTube, from a lot of really, really good experts. But you got to find the person who speaks to you, who speaks your, not language, your mind, right? The way your mind works. And that was part of the problem for me too. Some of these DDD, especially the people who are doing DDD early, like they much better minds than mine, right? Like, so I couldn't follow along until when I finally got it. That's why I was like, okay, here's my perspective on it. And Coco asks, Coco Miracle, funny name. Is that I love that name. Is that your online name? So why is DDD so hot recently? I think it's not that it's so hot recently. It's been around the first book came out in 2003. But maybe it's just getting talked about in more and more places, right? Here we are at a .NET conference, right? Although if you look at Microsoft documentation, they've been talking about domain-driven design for quite a while also, but it's not as it's just getting more spread out, I think. Anyway, where was I?
But I think your point though is that, again, different people learn in different ways. And you shouldn't get frustrated just because the first resource you go to doesn't quite click. And there is a certain amount of fundamental background you have to have before any of this makes sense. Like I made this analogy to my son last night. I said, listen, I could try to explain, pass by value versus pass by reference to you right now, but it wouldn't make any sense to you because you don't have enough grounding in computer science for those terms to click at all. I mean, and I know how to explain it, so I could totally do it, but it wouldn't be meaningful to him.
Yeah.
Much in the same way that he could explain some musical concepts that to him are no big deal. And I'd be like, I have no idea what the difference is between, a C sharp and an F minor. I don't even know if that's anything in music. So that you need to have a certain grounding for any of this to start to click, but you also need to be ready to attack it from different directions, try different sources, and don't be afraid to find one that resonates for you and the way you work and think.
Yeah. Plus, I think, and I guess you would agree, that there are so many projects, so many products, so many code bases that would just benefit from having value objects, or just aggregate roots, or just entities, or just some boundaries. You don't have to apply everything at once, right? Just doing a little helps.
Totally agree. And there are other areas of domain-driven design thinking that it is important to have somebody who knows what they're doing. But that's not about leveraging boundaries and aggregate roots. That's more about context mapping, right? Figuring out how those bounded contexts are going to relate to interact with each other, or maybe not directly with each other, but how are you going to make that happen, or understanding the events and understanding event flow and things like that. There you need a guide. There you need somebody who really knows what they're doing, right? But I didn't start learning about those things until later on. A lot of that has to do with the strategic side, right? Really strategizing before you start implementing. I started with the implementation. Now, that also, some DDD people were like, like it's both. They're both important, but they are both important. Like the whole big picture brings amazing ideas, like all the ideas of the strategizing, right? So many people don't even do any kind of strategizing. They're like, oh, let's start writing some code. Let's start designing databases, or let's start, designing screens, right? Instead of looking at the big picture. Now, sometimes that is okay, right? Like the whole thing about domain-driven design is it's for solving complex problems, right? So they're too complicated. I cannot keep the whole problem and all of its connections in my head at once. It's much too complicated. So looking for ways to break it apart. So that strategizing, even finding the boundaries, like, more deeply, more impactfully, that takes some experience. I mean, this is something I'll do when I'm working with teams. We'll just take one small thing and maybe not. Well, it depends. We do all kinds of things, right? But just the act of looking for boundaries, right? Which things are kind of like happen transactionally, right? Or where's a process that really seems like has a beginning and an end, and you can't get to the next stage until you get to the end of that, right? Just looking at things and event storming. Oh, I love event storming in person. Again, there's so much read the room going on there. So event storming is another way of doing discovery, right? Yeah. So discovery is really important. Collaborating is really important. Learning the domain, listening to, like the product owners or the business people, and understanding how they talk about what's going on in their business. That's really, really important. They're not talking about indexes and classes and, technical terms. They're talking about actual things happening.
So, I would even argue that some of the terms we just threw around are all ways for us to do discovery, right? Because if we talk about event storming, we talk about DDD, we talk about story mapping, we talk about any number of techniques. A lot of this boils down to how do we understand the domain? And, I stumbled upon this Rich Hickey quote where he talked about how most of the problems in software are problems of misconception. and that we're just in such a hurry that we don't even know what we're trying to build, but it's just, hey, we got the team, we got the coders, so get them going, get them start to sling code.
Right. Money. Come on, hurry up. Money's going down the drain already.
Well, my wife's a business analyst, and it's amazing how many times I hear this. Well, we don't even have the requirements yet. Well, but the developers are ready, so they're going to start building code. But build it to do what?
Yeah.
Well, they got to start working. You're going to throw that all away. Well, that's okay. I mean, it's really weird, some of these things, but I think that still speaks to what we talked about at the very beginning, right? Which is the fact that, yes, Java Grad says, stop solutioning me. Yeah, I know. Java Grad, Deshaun, I need new stories. That's what my grad students taught me earlier this semester. They have a bingo card of my phrases. So I clearly need some new phrases, but it's true that we all learn in different ways. We approach this in different ways. And I think that's part of the confusion around some of these topics. The goal is to try to understand the domain, and let's not get super caught up and very dogmatic around some of these phrases. The goal is to figure out what we're trying to build.
Yeah. And in that strategic, that's where you do need somebody who knows what they're doing. Right. And I started in tactical, right? Because I was making it easier for myself to write code and write maintainable and testable code, and code that didn't make my head explode, right? Like learning to break things apart and all of that. But the strategizing and the techniques of strategizing, that, when you're really dealing with a big project, and that's where you make sure, at least bring somebody in to help you, or or it depends on how big and how critical and how important and how much is involved there, right?
Right.
And sometimes it might not be that easy, and it's okay, right? It's okay to be wrong. I cannot agree more with that comment. I believe you learn when it feels awkward. When it feels natural, I'm not learning. So I've been recently watching and listening to a podcast called Huberman Lab. You probably know that. So it gives a ton of advice on how to learn, how to focus. And one of the advices was, you actually learn when you are frustrated, because this is when your brain actually turns on neuroplasticity. Mm-hmm. When you are frustrated, that's okay. Mm-hmm. That's where you want to be, because now you can actually learn and change your mind about something. So maybe it has to be, I want to say painful, but you know what I mean.
Well, it's no different than working out, Jakob, right? I mean, if you're not feeling a little bit of that pressure, then your body's not adapting. It's the same with your brain. If you're not stretching it a little bit, I mean, that's why I think it's so powerful to learn really different programming languages. Even if you don't use them on a regular basis, it changes how your brain thinks about problems, and it shows you solutions that you might not see if you just stick to whatever your favorite language happens to be.
Correct.
Just as a funny example of that, I had a client, a totally different kind of, not a coaching client, but a client for whom I have actually been writing software for bits and pieces for like 25 years. Anyway, they asked for this completely impossible report. I have been having so much fun in SQL Server building queries and building dynamic queries and figuring out how I could possibly get the data out the way they needed it. I haven't had a challenge. I haven't done anything like that in a while. And I love it. It is so much fun because my brain is just doing something so different.
Right.
And so engaging. And I know that somehow I will solve this problem, and I'm having a lot of fun along the way. And, and they don't mind paying me for that fun.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think that's a good point, right? Is that's what I love about this industry, is the fact that we get these fun problems to chew on. And that to me is the real sort of characteristic I'm looking for. You think about hiring and interviewing specific technologies, languages, like we can teach you all that. And there's going to be a new one in 2 years. So don't get too caught up in that. But do you like to solve problems? Do you like to tinker? Do you like to, okay, I want to get to the bottom of this. Are you frustrated when, well, I rebooted and it just worked, so I won't think about it again? Does that bother you just a little bit at least? You know, and it's that.
Well, when it comes to a computer, it does not bother me as long as it's working.
Right, as long as it works. But I mean, there's been a few times where I'm like, oh, yeah, this works. I'd love to tell you why, but
yeah. I like to know how things work and why they work the way they work. So, that kind of speaks to why, I was definitely more when my learning started in the transaction. I mean, in the technical, I'm reading a conversation about transactions on the tactical side. And that also created I was getting a little pushback in the DDD community because I wasn't expressing, the importance of the strategic side. I'm like, yeah, but I'm showing people how to use the Entity Framework Core to map their, classes and still make their classes beautiful and not go and change their classes to make EF Core happy, right? Like, so I'm using those ideas to help them understand that. But no matter what perspective of domain-driven design I'm teaching, I always, at some point say, I just, be aware there are two key, strategic and tactical. They are both equally important. You may be more involved in the tactical than the strategic, or more involved, but they are both very, very important parts of DDD. And then overlaying all of that is that collaboration. Mm-hmm. That's, I think, one of the things that really initially spoke to me about domain-driven design. I was not even familiar with DDD. I had written my first EF Core book. I know this 900-page freaking book. I was working on it.
We use those for monitor.
Yeah. Except the paperbacks, that kind of slides around and stuff. True. So maybe not great. Anyway, so I wasn't looking about DDD, but it was back in the old Entity Framework link to SQL days. And Jimmy Nilsson, who had written a book on doing applying domain-driven design with C# projects, had done a conference talk, and at the end they asked him just some questions, and there was this conversation about, what do you think about Entity Framework versus Link to SQL debate. So I went to watch this, just a 10-minute thing. And at the end, they asked, what's your favorite book? And he said, Domain-Driven Design, Eric Evans' Domain-Driven Design. And they said, why? He said, because it reads like poetry. And I just went, I'm writing my first technical book, right? A. B, my mother is a writer. Her very first novel she wrote was put up for a Pulitzer.
Wow.
Right? So she's a very creative person, right? And I was like, this intersection of like, what on earth does it mean to have a technical book read like poetry, right?
Right.
And I'm like, get in the book. I start reading it, and this is, now Eric says he would start with bounded context, but I'm glad he started the way he started. He started with a collaboration. And it's how I'd always worked with my clients. I loved learning about their businesses, how their businesses worked, becoming a real partner with them as I'm trying to help them solve their problems and build software to help them do that. So it spoke to me. It really, really spoke to me that about the collaboration. And that's what I started on my path.
So we might want to say that if we learn the domain, if we learn the business, if we learn the organization, not only we are debugging code, but also we are like debugging the entire organization and how they work and how they apply certain processes around their, code base.
But that's not going to be the job of every developer, right? True. Every person on the team, right? Like that's a big part of the strategic. But it's really important for everybody to have this understanding. Gone are the days. This client that I've been working with for a million years, there was a project they farmed out to replace some software I'd written in like 1985 or 95. They still haven't replaced it, but this was like 10 years ago. And the person who they hired to do it spent, I don't know, a few hours with them looking at the software that I'd spent years evolving, and said, I'll replace that for $10,000. I'll have it done in 2 months. I'll get back to you when it's done. Right. I learned everything I needed to learn. Bye. Right. A year later, right, still with that $10,000, bad move on his part. The client only paid him $10,000. A year later, he had kind of something and they just threw it away. They never used it. And people who worked there, they did not they said, we hate talking to him. Because God, I would hate if he was watching this, but I can't imagine he's in programming anymore. Right. Because they were so used to the way I interacted with him. It was just, it just can't be that way. You cannot write good software that way. You can't even go into a dentist office to help them build a solution. Hopefully they're using something off the shelf by now, by saying, oh, I've been going to the dentist all my life. I know how it works. I'll write this for you. No problem.
How hard could it be?
That's easy, right? Isn't it? So we have a great question from our teammate, by the way. Does DDD head towards event driven? What's your take?
There is a lot of events are very important to domain driven design, but there's a lot of different perspectives on how to go about thinking about events and applying them. So it's very, very important, like understanding the events and, one way of modeling, modeling by way of the events is actually a number of ways of doing that. And then when you think about event storming, that's like brainstorming with a focus on what happened, the truth of what really has happened, not what you want, but like the actual events of what's happening in your organization. That's what event storming is all about. And there's event modeling, right? That's a whole practice unto itself as well that, kind of goes along. So there's a lot of really interesting ways of doing that strategizing, so that DDD's idea of strategizing, but there's a lot of ways that people go about it, and there's a lot of these ways work really beautifully together, because sometimes you just need different perspective, right? So you look at it from this perspective, you look at it from that perspective. So, as always, long answer to a short question, to a yes or no question.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about this, Nate, right? What does it mean, event driven, by the way? Like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I was just going to make that comment that, event driven is one of those words where we probably need some better definitions there, because it means different things to different people. But I mean, to be fair, I guess I can say that about a lot of concepts in technology. And it is, well, what do you mean by event driven versus somebody else? So
the word context, that's extra hard when you're talking about entity framework. And that was that was a big thing for me. Like, a DB context is not the same as a bounded context. They have, first of all, the DB context is all about data persistence, and domain-driven design is not about, data persistence is almost like an afterthought. And that's okay. It's like, let's focus on solving the business problem. And the business problem is not how to store data. We know how to store data.
Right.
We know how to get the data in and out of the database. So, unless my joke I've made too many times. Maybe it's a new audience, unless you're writing the next Dropbox competitor, right?
Yep.
Your business domain is not about solving data persistence problems,
So
right?
it
We
seems
all
like
deal with that.
even the word context has to be put into context.
Context. It has to be put into context. Exactly.
Well played. Well played.
All right.
How are we doing with time?
I think we're just about ready to wrap up and bring Layla back into the picture here and transition into our next wonderful guest.
Do you remember Layla when I said to Layla, how long do we have? She said, I know how much you like to talk, so I'm going to say 7 minutes because then you'll probably be done on time.
Right. Yeah, well, we've had that running joke with Josh. It doesn't matter how much time you give him, he's going to exceed it. So if you tell him 20 minutes, maybe it'll be done in 2 hours. So yeah, you got to know how to box that in properly. But yeah, it's good. Well, I want to thank you so much. This has been fun. I really enjoyed our conversation earlier in the week. So this is great to get a chance to catch up with you again. And I want to thank you so much for hanging out with us. I really appreciate it.
Oh yeah. And thanks
so much
for being part of that. Yeah, it made it really fun instead of going, I'm going to just stare at the screen and give a presentation.